Hello, everyone. I am Davin Searles here from CSD Works. I'm the program manager, and thank you so much, Sarah, for being here with us today. We are really excited to partner with you. It's looking like some people are having some technical difficulties, so I've asked Claire to pin my video, which hopefully will help you be able to see me. You really should see three people. Myself, I have a beard, glasses, and a blue shirt. It may look like a purple shirt in your picture. Claire is also wearing glasses. And then we have Christina, our interpreter, in a black top. So if any of you are not able to see all three pictures, go ahead and click on the top view options drop down of side-by-side mode. Now, if you have an older version, you don't have that feature, but I'm hoping you can still access the caption link or go over to the chat box and link there, or hopefully you're still able to see and hear the presentation. So thank you for being here with us today. And also, I would like for you to look at the email that was sent out this morning. There are instructions there as well. So I've already introduced myself. I'll hand it over to Claire and allow her to introduce herself. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to host this webinar. My name is Claire Labrie. I'm the Client Support Specialist at CSD Works. I work with Davin very closely in this program, and I'm excited to present today. I'm going to hand it off to Davin now. Okay, so today we just have a brief hour together. So we're going to summarize how to find deaf and hard of hearing employees and capitalize on their success, which will in turn equal your success. This is an overview slide here. We'll show two scenarios about deaf and hard of hearing people, the value of hiring them, how to find their talent, as well as retain and nourish their talent. So part of what CSD does, we'll discuss, and then we'll close with some takeaways. So this is a safe space. Please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments. If there's anything at all you want to know, feel free to ask us. You can either type it in the chat box. Okay. So here we're envisioning a senior in college who's applying for a summer job, and he has found an opportunity to work at a summer program at a camp for troubled youth. And he will be given the opportunity to go out into nature, build fires, develop leadership skills. And he has great references. He sent his application online. He did all of the interviewing through email. His references were called. Everything worked out great. He was offered the job. And then the HR department, asked to have a follow-up interview, just to follow up with a few questions. And this young man said, "You can go ahead and call me through the relay service." HR was unsure. After hearing that, they felt, a deaf person really can't fulfill this job adequately. This is an actual situation that happened in 2007 to myself. This was my personal experience. Now I want to share another story with you. A young deaf woman was in one of the top nursing programs doing her residency at a university hospital. They had an operations revenue in the billions of dollars. She was working with two interpreters during her residency to facilitate communication. She communicated very well. She was well loved. Her supervisors in her unit loved her and recommended that she apply for a full-time position. So after graduating, she applied. She got a response 1 day later, an job offer. She filled out the paperwork, was excited to start her new job, And she let HR know that she needed just one interpreter. Then they went through an interactive accommodation process. HR told her that the cost for an interpreter was much too expensive, and they rescinded the job offer. And of course, this young woman was heartbroken and upset. She ended up deciding to sue. Long story short, she found another job at a hospital that did provide an interpreter, and she's been happy there. And the lawsuit actually was successful. They found that the hospital was in violation of ADA for rescinding this job opportunity. This happened in 2016, and this person was my sister. So these type of experiences happen every day, and I have to admit, myself and my sister, we are white, well-educated, privileged people, and you can imagine that people who are deaf with additional disabilities or deaf minorities have multiple barriers that they face. So that's why CSD Works is here. We want to partner with people like you who want to take advantage of using deaf talent and deaf skill. Now I'd like to introduce some statistics about deaf and hard of hearing people. When you cross someone on the street, you may not realize that a particular person is deaf unless they're wearing a hearing device, a cochlear implant, or a hearing aid, because deafness is an invisible disability. There's a total of 28 million Americans who are deaf or have hearing loss. And every year, 24,000 children are born with some level of hearing loss. 90% of these children are born to hearing parents. Research that was done in 2018 shows that it's an $86 billion market in people who are deaf and hard of hearing. That includes their friends, family members, colleagues, and co-workers. So it's a huge market out there. I want to touch on some common misunderstandings and misperceptions related to deaf and hard of hearing people. Often I'll meet people who think that all deaf people sign, and that is not true. Some deaf people prefer to speak and use their voice. Some people have a cochlear implant and a hearing aid and don't choose to speak, where others don't use a cochlear implant or a hearing aid and yet they do speak. Every deaf person has their own communication preference, and it varies widely. Just because a person's wearing a hearing aid does not mean that they can successfully hear everything. It really depends on a lot of factors: training, education, their background. It's not one size fits all. Many times I will meet people who will try to speak, and they're trying to give me an opportunity to lip read, but often deaf and hard of hearing people would prefer to write back and forth or use their phones to text back and forth, because research has proven that only 30 to 45% of speech is intelligible on the lips from lip reading. There's a lot of filling in the blanks with facial expressions, body language, and other cues to try to piece together the message. So now back to communication preference. As we mentioned, every deaf person has their own experience that separates them. So whatever your deaf or hard of hearing employees' preference is, do what you can to make sure that the workplace is set up to help them be successful. Their preference is how they will best succeed, so follow that. Communicating effectively will make things work easily. And really, the preference of their communication may depend on when they became deaf. If they were born deaf, or they became deaf as a child, as opposed to later on in life, if they still have some residual hearing, their family's background, whether they speak, their personal characteristics, their lip reading ability. Again, if you're not sure, just ask. Deaf culture, is a subset of the deaf and hard of hearing population. There is a subset of people who consider themselves a linguistic and cultural minority that share a heritage of language and culture. The language is American Sign Language, ASL. ASL is a recognized language. It is unique from English or Spanish in its grammar and syntax. It is completely separate from English. You may be interested to know that in England, actually, they use British Sign Language, which is completely different from ASL, American Sign Language, even though we both speak the same spoken language of English. There's actually 300 different sign languages around the world. So American Sign Language is my primary language, and I feel I'm a part of a signing community. Members of a signing community consider themselves to be bilingual, which means they have various degrees of fluency in ASL and English. The last point that I want to make on this slide is within all career fields, we're often asked what the ideal job is for a deaf person. Really, there are no ideal jobs. I know of deaf chefs, I know deaf restaurant owners, teachers, truck drivers, pilots, CEOs, comedians, entrepreneurs, post office workers, artists, college professors, and the list goes on. There are two great examples of famous deaf people who are in amazing positions. One is Leah Katz Hernandez, who was a receptionist for the President of the United States during Obama's presidency. And the other famous person you may be familiar with is Niall DeMarco. He's an actor, model, and he was the Dancing with the Stars winner. So it's truly amazing that, as you can see, there is not a one-size-fits-all role when it comes to career options for a deaf person. I'm now going to hand it over to Claire to share this comic strip with you. Thank you, Davin. I wanted to talk with you about this comic strip. In it, you have two people. You have a deaf person sitting next to a hearing person in a coffee shop. And the hearing person's just going on about their own business. And the hearing person writes a message to the deaf person saying, "Do you miss being able to hear?" The deaf person writes back and says, "No. Do you miss being deaf?" Hearing person says, "No, I've never been deaf." Then takes some time to think about it and realizes, gets it. Deaf people can't miss something that they've never had. And this is true. I'm sure the situation holds true for many deaf people. As Davin mentioned, there's a wide variety of types of deaf people. They have different backgrounds. People who became deaf later in life, latent deafened, have a different understanding than people who have been deaf their whole lives. Simply put, you can't miss something that you've never had. So now I'd like to talk about the value of hiring deaf and hard of hearing people. There truly is a great benefit there. One is the increased diversity. Companies can improve from hiring diverse people and minorities, having a more inclusive community. That includes the deaf community as well. Also, deaf people have unique visual abilities, which can help bring new perspectives to the workplace, a new way of thinking. It's a tremendous asset. Also, deaf people have oftentimes faced many barriers in their lives, which means that they're naturally great problem solvers. After addressing many issues, they have the tools ready for solutions. The U.S. Department of Education actually shows that workers who are disabled, fare at average or above average in the workplace in terms of quantity and quality of work. They're flexible. Their attendance is great. Also, an increase in labor pool. Nationwide, unemployment, right now the rate nationwide is 4%, but for the deaf community, unemployment and underemployment is at 70%, and that number persists. By hiring skilled and qualified deaf people for your company, you increase your workplace diversity. And also, that will make an impression, a great impression on the deaf community. You know, we're a small community and word spreads. If you are inclusive of deaf people, that will have a great impact on your revenue. Now, for your business, if you create a positive and welcoming environment, that will also facilitate the success of your deaf employee, and you will benefit in loyalty. That will lead to less turnover, less time and energy spent on looking for new staff. Also, there's diverse benefits. Deaf people bring a fresh perspective, fresh insights, and a cultural understanding that's required to really reach out to different markets and audiences out there. If you're thinking about hiring a deaf person and having a diverse workforce, that sends a message to the community of your values. The deaf community, like I mentioned, is very small, and they're very brand loyal. So if you hire deaf people or if you support the deaf market, deaf people will more likely frequent your business or support your company. Like Davin mentioned, the deaf community is an $86 billion market. Also, better communication is a benefit. A hiring manager may be unsure how to communicate upon hiring a deaf employee. Deaf people are very skilled and fluent communicators. They already have tools built in from facing all of the barriers they faced in the real world. Deaf people have these tools at the ready. Deaf people are great at turn taking, so talking one person at a time with sequential speakers, whereas hearing people typically will overlap and oftentimes interrupt one another. ASL is also a 3D language, which means deaf people make points, and they're simple and concise points, and hearing people will either make simple but vague points or very complex points that are hard to follow in comparison. Also, deaf people focus a lot on quality of conversation and socialization. One huge cultural importance is eye contact. It's very important to have eye contact to be sure that what is going on in the conversation is being understood. Oftentimes, hearing people can multitask in the middle of a conversation, and deaf people find that it's very important to have eye contact. Another thing that deaf people are good at is asking for clarification. If there's something they don't understand or need clarification on, they are not afraid to ask. And sometimes hearing people won't ask for repetition or for clarification as a comparison. So now, hiring and finding deaf talent, the big question is how? Number one, you want to make sure that your materials are accessible and welcoming. Typically, a deaf job seeker will want to know how deaf-friendly your company is, you and your company. If you have videos on your website, are your videos captioned? Better yet, are they signed in American Sign Language? There are a lot of websites that will offer automatic captioning or auto captioning. While it's a great idea, it's not always completely accurate or fully accessible. So then a deaf person may get a certain message if you're just using auto captioning that the company is really not considering their deaf audience. There may be promotional videos that are done beautifully well to promote job opportunities. And spending a little extra time and a little bit more budget to add captioning will result in reaching out and tapping into a huge pool of people that will bring a lot of quality into your workplace. Places that you can find deaf talent are, for an example, Gallaudet University. It's a deaf university in Washington, D.C. We also have RIT, Rochester, in Rochester, New York. There are job fairs as well, but keep in mind that only a small percentage of people live in mainstream environments. You're more likely to find deaf talent in local organizations or deaf schools. Also, you want to make sure you have adequate representation during recruitment. If you already have a deaf employee that's working at your company, put them in the front, on the front line. Send them out to the recruiting events because they already have the culture and the knowledge as far as what is needed to look for in deaf candidates. You can also do testimonials, a testimonial video that could be used for your social media platform, talking about how great it is to work for your company, how inclusive your company is. Something like that goes a long way. The point is, deaf people value trust and positive experiences of other deaf people. I'm now going to hand it over to Davin. Great, thank you, Claire. Okay, so I think we're all on the same page about the great talent pool that deaf and hard of hearing people are. So now how do you find and hire them? It's very important that you review your application process. Your application portal should have clear and easy to follow instructions. Many deaf and hard of hearing people are talented in American Sign Language, but their English skills may not be at the same level. Many deaf or hard of hearing people may struggle completing an application because of some simple errors. So if you could provide instructions in American Sign Language, that would be the ultimately best way. Or if you could put things more into picture form. If you have a form or a button that they could click where they can request accommodations, that will really relieve a lot of anxiety that deaf and hard of hearing people face when they're deciding whether or not to apply for a job. I also saw someone ask this question related to English grammar. American Sign Language and English are two completely different languages. They have a completely different language structure. As you can see, like in the speech bubbles here, it says, from where? Type fast I can. House huge. This is the structure, the grammatical structure in American Sign Language. In Sign Language, it makes sense, but in English, it seems a bit odd. So just because a person's English is not, if they're not proficient, does not mean that they won't be able to follow instructions. That's not true at all. There are a lot of strategies that deaf people use to work around that. If you could email a template even for them to use and then follow up through relay calls, that's one solution. You can develop different agreements with other colleagues to support them by email, and also face-to-face interactions really work best with deaf and hard of hearing people because deaf people already have built-in tools to communicate based on their experiences every day. Communicating with people who don't know American Sign Language or communicating with people who have never spoken with a deaf or hard of hearing person. We have many tools and ways to figure it out. Also, don't hang up. What I mean by that is if you receive a relay call, it's often confusing for people who have never experienced one. If you don't know what a relay call is, basically, myself as a deaf person, I could type or I could be signing on a video screen to an operator. The operator will either be reading what I'm typing over text and speak it over the phone, or we'll be able to see what I'm signing over the video and speak it to the hearing person on the other end. Oftentimes, hiring managers will get a call saying, hello, this is operator 4567, and it sounds like a telemarketer or a scam, when in fact it's not. Deaf people get hung up on all the time because of this. So if you really want to reach out to the deaf and hard of hearing market, make sure your hiring managers know not to hang up. Also, when you speak to a deaf person through an operator or an interpreter, don't use phrases like tell him or ask her. Speak directly to the deaf or hard of hearing person. Also, use appropriate accommodations. This is very important. Just because an employee knows ASL, regardless of how fluent they are, it doesn't mean that they are qualified to interpret for a job interview or a job training. Interpreters go to school for many years, and they train how to facilitate communication effectively between the two languages and make sure that there is no information lost. They are also trained on ethics. And once someone graduates from an interpreting program, it does not mean that they're ready to interpret yet either. They have to become certified. And then once they're certified and have more years of experience, then they may be the right fit for a specific situation. If there's a situation that has more complications, like let's say a software engineering interview or an interview for a pharmacist, you're going to have to find an interpreter who's proficient in that particular subject matter. So Claire had one example that recently happened to you. I'll let you explain it. Yes, thank you, Davin. I actually just recently bought a house with my partner. Congratulations, thank you. So the two of us went to the bank and we spoke with our loan officer. But before doing so, I asked if they could hire an interpreter. And really, it was my fault for not asking specifically for a certified interpreter. So I just asked for an interpreter. And the person said, actually, we have an interpreter on our staff. And I thought in the back of my mind, okay, that's great. All right, let's see how this goes. Thank you. So when it was time for our actual meeting with the loan officer, the bank employee who knew some sign language came and sat down with us. And as we started the meeting, she only knew basic sign language, like baby sign language. She knew enough finger spelling and maybe some of the bank terms. But I'm sure those of you who have bought a home and you know how dense the paperwork is that's involved in filling out a loan application, you know, when you're working with an employee and you're imagine working through an interpreter who only knows a few signs. A meeting that should have taken 1 hour was stretched to 2 hours because there was so much overlap, clarification, trying to figure out what they were really saying. So I cannot impress enough the importance of having a certified interpreter who knows the terminology within that situation or any situation or meeting that you're in. Thank you, Claire. Yes, and unfortunately, this type of thing happens often to deaf and hard of hearing people. So please keep that in mind. And if you're not sure where to find a service provider, you can reach out to us. You can reach out to us or local interpreting agencies or deaf organizations in your community, in your area, and they can point you in the right direction. So last point on the slide, always, if you're unsure, just ask. There are many hiring managers, like at my story at the beginning when I applied for a job, they assumed that because I was a deaf person, I wouldn't be able to fulfill the requirements of that job. but really, they should have reviewed the essential job duties with me to make sure that I could fulfill them, because I truly could have met every single one, rather than assuming. Protect yourselves and ask, engage. And if you're not sure what accommodations that candidate or employee needs on a daily basis, again, just ask. More often than not, deaf or hard of hearing people are not hired, or they don't make it through the hiring process because of misassumptions. One great example of a misassumption is cost of accommodations. So now here's a question, true or false, I want to pose to all of you. Accommodations for deaf employees are typically expensive and can impact your ability to hire within your budget. If we have a brave soul who wants to type something in the chat, I'll give you a minute. Please type your answer. What do you think it is, true or false? Yeah, so we have one response. Oh, looks like we're getting some more responses. Yes, many responses. Yes, that are correct. Yes, it is false. 2/3 of accommodations actually cost less than $500, and 1/4 costs nothing at all. So what I was saying about employers, if they simply have this tool, I'll show you a pen. I'm holding up a pen. Then you're all set. This is all the tools you need to really successfully communicate with your deaf or hard of hearing employees. Use tools that you already have. Many people, instead of having face-to-face conversations with a colleague, even at the next cubicle or the next office, send IM or messages through Slack or email. In today's world, we already have so many tools available to us. So it does not mean that pen and paper or Slack or instant message is always going to be good enough in every situation. But again, you want to work with that individual on an individual basis and situational basis. But just keep that in mind, that the focus is inclusive accommodations that you can start from the beginning. You can start building a place, like back when elevators were being added to buildings to accommodate ADA. It was a huge expense in the beginning, but now, it's not even a thought. So I now want to go back to Claire. We have about, let's see, the time is 1:36. So we have about 20-something minutes, and we want to open up time for Q&A. So now about retaining and nourishing your deaf and hard of hearing talent. Sometimes if you hire someone, you'll see some challenges. If the employee is underperforming, you may wonder why. Just ask them. Get a feel. It could be an environmental contribution. For example, a distribution warehouse typically has a large room with scanners that are used for barcodes of different packages and boxes that matches up with inventory. And the scanner is usually auditory based. There's a beep. So if a deaf person, for a deaf person who can't hear the beep, there may be a lag because they may rely on a light to flash or to light up. And there may not even be a light that could guarantee that they have the correct inventory or that the scan has been recognized. So there could be an environmental reason for why a particular deaf employee is underperforming. Also during a meeting, you may have a deaf employee who is not really participating in group dialogue during meetings. Don't assume the reason why, check in with them. Typically, deaf people don't know when is a good time to contribute or when to speak up. Often there is a auditory cue when a person is wrapping up their sentence, but deaf people can't cue into that. So it's hard for them to know when it might be their turn coming up. They end up expending a lot of energy trying to figure that out. You could establish a protocol by asking your group to raise hands and to create fair turn taking, which really will benefit everyone. Also, offering accessible professional development opportunities for deaf people. If you have a deaf employee who's progressing well in their job, and then they're noticing other employees who are receiving advancement and opportunities for professional development when they're not, oftentimes deaf people do not get equal advancement opportunities for professional development because of lack of access. But if they get an advance or they get professional development, it is often at the mercy of the accommodations provider, unfortunately. So if they have an interpreter who is not certified, or they have a captioner who is not skilled, then the deaf person will unfortunately fall behind as a result. Make sure that your interpreters are certified and that your captioners know what they're doing. Also, go ahead, go above and beyond just compliance. You can provide an interpreter maybe at the last hour of a meeting to make sure that all of the communication access is there. Also hiring multiple deaf people to generate a support system so that there's comfortable rapport and in an interactive way to bounce ideas off of one another in that deaf collective, in that deaf group. Also providing materials and things in ASL or with captioning for your training materials. It's important to make sure that your workplace is not only accessible, but also inclusive and culturally sensitive of deaf people. I know this is a lot of information and we're probably overwhelming you today, but we support you. And so just a little bit about what we can do to help you is we can provide additional resources and webinars. There's more trainings for you and your deaf and hard of hearing employees. We also promote featured jobs, which means we have a website where we will post jobs basically that deaf people can look at. And it removes the barriers of deaf people wondering if a particular job or company is deaf friendly. They can confidently apply knowing that they'll be provided with appropriate accommodations and that there will be cultural sensitivity. Also providing American Sign Language classes. Also assessing your workplace to make sure, we can assess your workplace and make sure that it is accommodating for deaf and hard of hearing employees. We can also help you with the onboarding process. If you need additional training, we're always here to help you all. So we're going to wrap up soon. Here are some takeaways that we want you to keep in mind. Really, you want to demonstrate your commitment to accessibility by captioning your videos and hiring certified interpreters. I know we've been saying this a lot, but it truly is important. Also, train your hiring managers on how to respond to relay calls and to work with service providers. The third point is you are ready. If you never hire a deaf person, then you will never be ready. Hiring a deaf or hard of hearing person will automatically help improve your skill. And that deaf person also can help you improve your skill. Having a workplace environment that's positive for deaf people will cause them to be more successful and invest more in your company. So that means not only providing accommodations, but also believing in them. Having that they have the same capabilities of everyone else in your workplace. Give them appropriate responsibilities, just as you would any other employee. And remember, the deaf community is very close and tight-knit. and small. So word of mouth really goes a long way. If the word gets out that your company is inclusive, deaf people are very brand loyal. So I now want to take a moment to look at the next slide, open it up for questions, and we also want to thank Sarah and GettingHired for helping us with today's webinar. Yes.
Great, and thank you so much.
Oh, I just want to open it up to anyone who has any questions. Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
Absolutely. We did receive a couple of questions. So the first question that I wanted to ask has to do with the correlation between ASL and written communication. And the question is, as most roles require above average written communication, and not all of us speak or know ASL, and the scenario is this person had a deaf candidate who they were working with to recruit for a role in a particular organization, and the individual was fluent in ASL, but there were some noticeable gaps in this person's education when it came to writing or their writing style or communication. And they found out that there isn't a direct correlation between ASL or a direct translation between ASL and written English. So again, the question is, can you talk to that point? Can you explain how ASL translates to written English? And also, is it true that someone who is fluent in ASL may not have as strong of a written communication skill set?
I can speak to that. This is Davin. Yes, I'd be happy to answer that question, and thank you for asking. Right, each deaf and hard of hearing person has different skill sets. Some people are skilled at speaking, but maybe their writing skills are not so great. Other people are great at writing, but not so much speaking. Or maybe they're more skilled at signing or not so much. Again, it goes back to different strategies. You want to develop a roster or a portfolio of templates that the deaf person or hard of hearing person can use and pull from and tweak to use to communicate. Also, focus on that person's time by calling through relay for more turn-taking conversations. That's more effective if the deaf person comfortably uses American Sign Language. Also, having an interpreter in person there who can sign and interpret between all parties there. Again, just because if they're English, they're not fluent in English, you can find other ways to communicate. But going back to deaf and hard of hearing people, that person will know best. If you notice that maybe their writing skills are not exactly up to par, ask them, how they would prefer to proceed with communicating with the hearing people in their environment. Claire's saying, I'd also like to add that deaf people are typically great advocates for themselves. As I mentioned, they face a lot of barriers in their life, and so they may not always be willing to advocate for themselves. But it's important that, people educate one another. I think I see one more question here from Lori. Lori is saying, how and where can we post some of our roles? Okay, this is Davin. I'll be happy to answer that. I encourage you to post on GettingHired as well as let us know. CSD has been established for over 40 years. We're well known in the deaf community. And so if you post on GettingHired as well as with us, and we will have a link to the GettingHired website as well, but that will show the deaf community that you have a connection with us, which shows that you're open-minded and A lot of deaf and hard of hearing people are anxious in the stage of deciding whether or not to apply for a company, at a particular company for a job or not, because of various experiences like getting hung up on and so forth. So yes, please do. Please share that with us. Are there any other questions, Claire Singh?
And I do have a couple other questions that I wanted to ask just to help reiterate some of the content, because so much great information was shared as well. And these are some of the questions, the top questions that we receive from our employer partners. One of them is, where can I find an interpreter? Is there a particular resource that you can suggest? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but I think the scenario is when job seekers may need an interpreter and employers are working to have a solid accommodation process and resources in place, interpreters are one of the scariest resources because it's thought that they're very expensive, they're not easy to find, and it just seems like a topic that people are very unsure about. So is that something that you can speak to again?
This is Davin. Yes, that's actually a great question. I'll go ahead and respond to that wonderful question. And yes, I can imagine that that is a challenge for many people. The best thing to do is, one, contact the local RID chapter, Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. RID, that's the certifying body that certifies interpreters. It's not the only certifying body, but it's the one that is nationwide. And they can refer you to where the certified interpreters are working or which agencies they're working for. Also, reach out to local deaf organizations. Many states have an association of the deaf or an office of the deaf and hard of hearing or a similar type name. So contact them and they can also refer you. Also, as I mentioned, CSD has a long list of different interpreters all over the country. So if you're not sure, go ahead and ask us at CSD and we'd be happy to provide that information and make that available to you. Lastly, we have an e-guide. It's like an ebook, but it's a shorter version that focuses on best practices when hiring and working with sign language interpreters. So I'll send you that link after this webinar, and that resource is also available for your use. Most important thing is to make sure that the interpreter is certified. Unfortunately, there are many groups or agencies that are hiring interpreters that are fresh out of college or not yet certified, and it can really truly damage your reputation and skew the communication process. So make sure that you're asking that they are certified and ensuring that they're certified.
And going along with that, those are some great resources. Thank you so much for sharing. Another question that we typically receive as a follow-up is, will the candidate or employee often provide their own interpreter? Again, something that we tell employers is a lot of times individuals with disabilities know what their accommodation is or know what they may need because they've lived with this disability for a long enough time. So what are the chances that the person may already provide their own interpreter and come with the interpreter, or provide one of these suggested resources that you say versus employers being responsible for that? Do you suggest that employers should proactively mention some of these resources that they're aware of to employees if it's disclosed that the individual is deaf or hard of hearing?
Another great question, and I'm really happy to respond. This is Davin. Yes, I will say that often deaf or hard of hearing people have preferred interpreters that they work with. Now, there are deaf professionals who work full-time in environments where they need interpreters that they call a designated interpreter. It's someone who is responsible to be their voice in their ears and to know them and to develop a tight relationship, and someone who understands their professional jargon. So when it comes to chosen for the interpreter. So the deaf, I'm sorry, we had a technical issue for a moment. Let me back up. So the deaf person may have names or recommendations as far as who they would prefer to use as an interpreter. In the deaf community, we know who's especially skilled for certain types of jobs and who to avoid. So basically, yes, you can ask the deaf person, but the contract process, the searching process, and agreeing with an interpreter on their rates and their time, and talking about the content of the meeting, the deaf person should not be responsible for setting that accommodation up. You should work directly with the interpreter or an agency to administrate all of that. You can always ask the deaf person for recommendations, but don't expect the deaf or hard of hearing person to work out those accommodations themselves.
Great. Thank you so much, Davin. I think that's a really great summary of a lot of the content that you all shared today, and I want to thank you again, and just great answers to a lot of the questions that we typically receive from employers. I don't have any other questions at this time, and happy to give everybody a couple minutes back to their day, but if we do receive any other questions afterwards, I'll be sure to follow up with you and loop you into that conversation. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining today's presentation, and Claire and Davin especially for all of this great information and your time today.